The Long Ships. Part 1. The Long Voyage. Chapter 2. Concerning Krok's expedition, and how Orm set forth on his first voyage. In the 40th year of King Harald Bluetooth's reign, 6 summers before the Jomsvikings' expedition to Norway, 3 ships, fitted with new sails and boldly manned, set sail from the Listerland and headed southwards to plunder the country of the Wends. They were commanded by a chieftain called Krok. He was a dark-complexioned man, tall and loose-limbed, and very strong, and he had a great name in his part of the country, for he possessed a talent for evolving audacious plans and enjoyed deriding men whose enterprises had gone astray and telling them what he would have done if he had been in their shoes. He had never in fact achieved anything of note, for he preferred to talk of the feats he intended to perform in the near future. But at length he had so fired the young men of the district with his talk of the booty that brave warriors might win in the course of a properly conducted expedition against the Wends, that they had got together and fitted out ships, and had chosen him to be their chieftain. There was, he had told them, much treasure to be found in Wendland, and above all, one could be certain of a fine haul of silver, amber, and slaves. Krok and his men reached the Wendish coast and discovered the mouth of a river, up which they rowed against a strong current until they came to a wooden fortress, with piles forming a boom across the river. Here they went ashore in a grey dawn twilight and attacked the Wends, having first slipped through their outlying defences. But the fortress was strongly manned, and its defenders shot arrows at them cunningly, and Krok's men were tired with their heavy rowing, so there was a bitter struggle before the Wends were finally put to flight. In the course of it, Krok lost many good men, and when the booty was examined, it was found to consist of a few iron kettles and some sheepskin coats. They rowed back down the river and made an attempt on another village farther to the west, but it too was well defended, and after another sharp struggle, in which they sustained further losses, they won a few sides of smoked pork, a torn chain shirt, and a necklace of small worn silver coins. They buried their dead on the shore and held council. And Krok had some difficulty in explaining to them why the expedition had not turned out as he had foretold. But he succeeded in calming their temper with well-chosen words, reminding them that no man could insure against bad luck or the whims of circumstance, and that no true Viking allowed himself to become dispirited by a little adversity. The Wends, he explained, were becoming redoubtable adversaries, and he had a good plan to put to them, which would certainly redound to the advantage of them all. This was that they should make an attempt against Bornholm, for the richness of that island's inhabitants was well known to them all, and it would be weakly defended, many of its warriors having recently gone to England. A sure thrust here would meet with little opposition, and would be sure to yield a rich harvest of gold, brocades, and fine weapons. They found this well spoken, and their spirits rose again, so they set sail and headed for Bornholm, which they reached early one morning. They rowed along the eastern coast of the island in a calm sea, and a rising haze, searching for a good landing place, pulling briskly and keeping well together, for they were in high good humour, but they kept silence, for they hoped to land unobserved. Suddenly they heard ahead of them the clank of rowlocks and the plash of oar-blades dipping evenly, and out of the haze appeared a single long ship approaching round a headland. It made toward them without slackening its stroke, and they all stared at it, for it was large and splendid to behold, with a red dragon head at its prow, and 24 pair of oars, and they were glad, that it was unaccompanied. Krok ordered all his men who were not engaged at the oars to take up their weapons and stand ready for boarding, for here there was plainly much to be won. But the lone ship headed straight toward them, as though its helmsman had not observed their presence, and a stoutly built man, standing in the prow, with a broad beard visible beneath his bossed helmet, cupped his hand to his mouth as they approached, and roared in a harsh voice, "Get out of our way, unless you want to fight!" Krok laughed, and his men laughed with him, and he shouted back, "Have you ever seen 3 ships give way to 1? "Aye, and more than 3, roared the fat man impatiently, "for most men give way to Styrbjorn. But be quick about it, and make your choice. Get out of our way, or fight." When Krok heard the fat man's words, he made no reply, but silently turned his ship aside, and his men rested on their oars, while the lone ship rowed past them. Nor did any of them unsheath his sword. They saw a tall young man in a blue cloak, with fair down lining his jaw, rise from his resting place beside the helmsman, and stand surveying them with sleepy eyes, grasping a spear in his hand. He yawned broadly, dropped his spear, and laid himself again to rest. And Krok's men realized that this was Bjorn Olafsson, commonly called Styrbjorn, the banished nephew of King Eric of Uppsala, who seldom sought refuge from storm and never from battle, and whom few men willingly encountered at sea. His ship proceeded on its course, its long oars sweeping evenly, and disappeared southwards into the haze. But Krok and his men found their previous high spirits difficult to recover. They rowed to the eastern Skerries, which were uninhabited, and there they landed and cooked a meal and held long council. Many of them thought that they would do best to turn for home, seeing that bad luck had followed them, even to Bornholm. For if Styrbjorn was in these waters, the island was sure to be swarming with Jomsvikings, in which case there would be nothing left for any other raiders. Some of them said that there was little use in going to sea with the sort of chieftain who gave way to a single ship. Krok was at first less eloquent than usual, but he had ale brought ashore for them all, and after they had drunk, he delivered a speech of encouragement. In one sense, he was ready to admit it might be considered unfortunate that they had encountered Styrbjorn in this manner, but if you looked at it another way, it was extremely fortunate that they had encountered him when they did, for if they had come ashore and met them, or other Jomsvikings there, they would have had to pay dearly for it. All Jomsvikings, and none more so than Styrbjorn's men, were half berserk, sometimes even being proof against iron, and able to lay about them with both hands full, as well as the best warriors from Lister. That he had been reluctant to order an assault on Styrbjorn's ship might, at first sight, appear odd to idle-thinking men. Nevertheless, he regarded his reluctance as fully justified, and considered it a fortunate that he had made his decision so promptly. For a homeless and exiled pirate would hardly be likely to have sufficient treasure stored away in one place to be worth a bloody battle, and he would remind them that they had not come to sea to win empty honour, but to secure hard booty. In view of all this, he had thought it more proper to consider the general good than his own reputation as a warrior, and if they would reflect, he felt sure that they would agree that he had acted in this affair in a manner befitting a chieftain. As he thus cunningly dispersed the fog of dejection which had settled on his men's spirits, Krok began to feel his own courage rising anew, and he proceeded to exhort them strongly against making for home. For the people of Lister, he said, were inclined to be uncharitable, and the women in particular would ply them with painful queries regarding their exploits, and the prizes they had won, and why they had returned so soon. No man proud of his good name would thus willingly lay himself open to the shafts of their mockery. Therefore, he suggested, it would be better if they could postpone their return until they had won something worth bringing home. The important thing now, he concluded, was that they should remain together, face their adversities with courage and resolution, and determine on some worthy goal to which to proceed, on which matter, before he spoke any further, he would like to hear the views of his wise comrades. One of the men then proposed that they should go to the land of the Livonians and the Kurs, where there was a rich harvest to be reaped. But this suggestion won little support, for men of greater experience knew that large shiploads of Swedes descended annually on those regions, and it was not to be reckoned that they would prefer a warm welcome to any strangers who arrived on the same errand. Another man had heard that the greatest single hoard of silver in the world was to be found in Gotland, and he thought that they should try their hand there. But others of his companions who knew better said that nowadays, since the Gotlanders had become rich, they lived in large villages, which could be successfully attacked only by a powerful army. A third man then rose to address them, a warrior called Bersa, who was a wise speaker and prized by all for his sound judgment. He said that the Eastern Sea was becoming a crowded and unrewarding pasture, for far too many men were plundering its coasts and islands, so that even such peoples as the Wends were learning how to defend themselves. It would be a poor thing to turn meekly for home. On that point, he was of the same opinion as Krok, but it was, he thought, worth considering whether they might not sail out to the lands in the west. He had never himself travelled to those parts, but certain men from Scania, whom he had met at a fair during the previous summer, had been in England and Brittany with Toke Gormsson and Sigvalde Jarl, and had had much to say in praise of those countries. They wore gold rings and costly garments, and according to their report, certain companies of Vikings had anchored their ships in Frankish estuaries for months on end, while they plundered the hinterland, and these men had frequently had burgomasters and abbots to wait at them at table, and the daughters of counts to make them merry in bed. How strictly his informants had kept to the truth, he could not, of course, say, but as a general rule, you could believe about half of what Scanians told you, and these men had made an impression on him of considerable prosperity, for they had invited him, a stranger from Blekinge, to join them in a grand drinking bout, and had not attempted to steal his belongings while he slept, so that their story could not be altogether false. Besides which, it was more or less confirmed by reports he had heard from other quarters. Now, where Scanians had prospered, men of Blekinge ought to fare at least as well. Therefore, he concluded, he, for his part, would suggest that they would sail to the lands of the west, if a majority among his comrades were of the same mind. Many of them applauded his proposal and cried assent, but others doubted whether they were sufficiently provisioned to carry them through until they came to their goal. Then Krok spoke again. He said that Bersa had made exactly the suggestion that he himself had thought of putting forward. Bersa had spoken of the daughters of counts and of wealthy abbots, for the return of whose persons they would receive large ransoms, and he would like to add that in Ireland there were, as was well known, no less than 160 kings, some great, some small, but all of whom possessed much gold and many fine women, and whose soldiers fought wearing only linen garments, so that they could not be difficult to overcome. The most difficult part of their voyage would be passing through the Sound, where they might find themselves attacked by the natives of those parts. But 3 strongly manned ships, which Styrbjorn himself had not dared to challenge, would be likely to command respect, even in the Sound. Besides which, most of the Vikings of that region would, at this time of year, already have sailed westwards, and in any case, there would be no moon during the next few nights. As regards food, any that they needed they could easily obtain as soon as they had successfully negotiated the Sound. By this time they had recovered all their former high spirits. They said that the plan was a good one, and that Krok was the wisest and cleverest of all chieftains, and they were all proud to discover how little trepidation they felt at the prospect of a voyage to the lands of the West, for no ship from their district had attempted such a journey within living memory. They set sail and came to Moan, and rested there for a day and a night, keeping a good lookout and waiting for a favourable wind. Then they headed up through the Sound in stormy weather, and came that evening to its neck without meeting any enemies. Later, during the night, they anchored in the lee of the mound, and decided to go ashore in search of provisions. 3 companies landed secretly, each in a different place. Krok's company was lucky, for they came at once upon a sheepfold near a large house, and managed to kill the shepherd and his dog before they could give the alarm. Then they caught the sheep and cut the throats of as many as they could take with them, but this caused the animals to bleat loudly, so that Krok bade his men make haste with the work. They returned to the ship by the way they had come, making as much speed as they could, each man bearing a sheep over his shoulder. They heard behind them the clamour of people who had awakened in the house, and soon there arose the harsh yowling of dogs that had been unleashed on their scent. Then they heard from farther off a woman's voice, which, piercing through the noise of the dogs and men, cried, "Wait! Stay with me!" and screamed, "On!" several times, and then again cried, "Wait!" very shrilly and despairingly. Krok's men had difficulty in moving quickly with their loads, for the path was stony and steep, and the night was cloudy and still almost pitch dark. Krok himself went last in the line, carrying his sheep over his shoulder and holding an axe in his other hand. He was anxious, if possible, to avoid becoming involved in a fight for the sake of a sheep, for it was not worth while to risk life and limbs for so little. So he drove his men forward with harsh words of rebuke, and when they stumbled or slackened speed. The ship lay hard by some flat rocks, being held away from them by the oars. They were ready to pull out as soon as Krok returned, for the other landing parties had already returned empty-handed. Some of them were waiting on the beach in case Krok should need any assistance. They were only a few paces from the ship when 2 great dogs came bounding down the path. One of them leapt at Krok, but he jumped aside and struck it with his axe. The other flashed past him with a huge leap at the man just in front of him, knocked him over by its impetus, and buried his teeth in his throat. 2 of the others hastened forward and killed the dog, but when they and Krok bent over the man who had been bitten, they saw that his throat was badly torn, and that he was rapidly bleeding to death. In the same instant, a spear hissed past Krok's head, and 2 men came running down the slope and out on the flat rocks. They had run so fast that they had outstripped all their companions. The foremost of them, who was bareheaded and bore no shield, but carried a short sword in his hand, tripped and fell headlong on the rocks. 2 spears flew over him and hit his companion, who crumpled to the ground. But the bareheaded man was at once on his feet again, baying like a wolf. He hewed at one man who had leapt forward with his sword raised when he had fallen, and felled him with a blow on the temples. Then he sprang at Krok, who stood just behind him. All this happened very quickly. He aimed savagely at Krok, but Krok was still carrying his sheep, and he slipped it round to meet the blow, in the same instant striking his adversary with the reverse edge of his axe on the forehead, so that he fell to the ground, senseless. Krok bent over him, and saw that he was no more than a youth, red-haired and snub-nosed and pale-complexioned. He felt with his fingers the place where the axe head had landed, and found that the skull was unfractured. "I shall take the calf with me, as well as the sheep," he said. "He can row in place of the man he killed." So they picked him up, and carried him onto the ship, and threw him beneath an oar bench. Then, when they had all come aboard, except the 2 men who they had left dead behind them, they pulled out to sea, just as a large crowd of pursuers appeared on the beach. The sky had now begun to lighten, and some spears were thrown at the ship, but they did no damage. The men pulled strongly at their oars, happy in the knowledge that they had fresh meat on board, and they had already gone a long way from land when the figures on the beach were joined by a woman in a long blue shift, with her hair streaming behind her, who ran to the edge of the rocks and stretched out her arms toward the ship, crying something. Her cry reached them as a thin sound across the water, but she stood there long after they had ceased to hear her. In this wise, Orm, the son of Tosta, who later came to be known as Red Orm, or Orm the Far-Travelled, set forth on his first voyage.